So happy to be here. I've never been to India ever before, so this is my first time. I've had some culture shocks already the last couple of days. It's been interesting, it's been intense. Yesterday we had a dinner and people were ordering food for me, so that was a big surprise. I want to talk to you about scaling today, and when we talk about scaling in our industry, we talk about the ability to handle growth, right? And sometimes that growth is very sudden, like when there's Cyber Weekend and a lot of people are trying to buy stuff for their loved ones for the holidays. So we talk about scaling, the ability to handle growth, either sudden growth or more gradual growth that we hope that accompanies a great go-to-market strategy. The ability for us to handle growth, the ability for us to scale, it determines really the long-term success of any business. And I want to talk to you about how scaling also applies to architecting your presence on GitHub today. I'm talking about GitHub just because that is the platform that we use at my employer, and it's the one that I have most working experience with, but I guess this will work for any other code hosting platform as well. It will still be applicable, I think, for your organization and the way that you organize your work in the open. If you want to get a solid understanding of, like the rise and really the sort of subculture that GitHub is, I can super recommend reading this book, Working in Public by Nadia Ekbal. It's an excellent book on GitHub and the rise of GitHub. So before we dive in, because I'm not only Barbie from the Netherlands, I'm a staff community program manager at Ivan. I'll talk a little bit more about Ivan in a minute. I worked there in the developer relations team before, and before I joined Ivan, I worked at Grafana Labs, which you might know, and Microsoft as well. And before that, I worked at a great many number of startups in the open source ecosystem. I'm a DevOps Days core member. That means that's sort of the body that is above all of the cities, helping cities out, getting started, figuring out how to even host a DevOps Days. And I should know, because I also organize DevOps Days Amsterdam and Eindhoven, which is another city in the Netherlands. Actually, we just had DevOps Days Eindhoven last week, so I'm on a DevOps Days tour a little bit. I will also organize other conferences like Community Over Code in Bratislava, Slovakia next year. That's the former Apache Con, if you're familiar. But I don't necessarily come from DevOps, and that's something I want to share with you. I'm actually an art school graduate, so I didn't take a very traditional route into technology. I made art, right? And then because stuff was not getting fixed anymore, because that's not something that is fun to work on. And I thought, well, like maybe I can just learn how to code, and I can fix all of these problems for our members, and then they'll be very happy again, right? And so I started learning Ruby on Rails. And to learn Ruby on Rails, I used the Rails Girls guides. I don't know how many people are familiar with Rails Girls as a community, but the guides are absolutely fantastic. And so I started following the Rails Girls guides, and then sometimes I would get stuck because there was a mistake in the guide, or there was a gem version mismatch, or they assumed that you were using some sort of operating system that I wasn't. And someone told me that, like whenever you get stuck and you figure out why you get stuck, you can actually go into the guides and update them. And that was so mind-blowing to me that I could just fix something in a guide so that the next person wouldn't get stuck. And that was my first introduction to open source, and I was absolutely sold. I thought that was the most wonderful thing I had ever heard of. And so I was sold on open source, and I never looked back. To illustrate the problem that I want to talk to you about, I need to show you a little bit of the service overview that we have at Ivan. So Ivan is a data platform. We host all of these data tools that you see on the sort of first row. And then you see all of the hosts that we connect to, all of the deployment methods that we support, and all of the, small selection of the tools that we have in our third-party marketplace. This is a lot of stuff, and this all lives on our GitHub organization as mirrors of these major projects, or connectors, or operators, DSLs. And this list is ever growing, and it starts to look a little bit like the CNCF landscape. If you have if that's an image that you have in your head, and if that's not an image you have in your head, this is what it looks like. I really hope that we're not going towards supporting these many tools, but it's getting a lot. Start of 2023. At this point, I am with Ivan for like a year, and Ivan got started in 2016 by 4 Postgres maintainers or contributors. They just got tired of implementing the same thing for their customers over and over again, so they decided to build a platform around it. And then they hosted their solutions for Postgres on a GitHub organization. And as the years went by, they added more and more solutions to their GitHub organization, started to grow, right? Also in February 2023, we're 450 employees and we're an engineering company. There's a lot of engineering going on, means a lot of repositories added to that organization as well. And at this time, the number of repositories that we have in our GitHub organization is in the several hundreds. And it's a combination of forks of the projects that we work on, so Apache Kafka, Apache Cassandra. So it's a mix of the forks of these upstream projects that you saw before. Then there is some non-public source code because, for instance, Postgres is not developed on GitHub, if you knew. And so we do have a private fork of Postgres on our GitHub. Then there is libraries that we have open sourced or that we have assumed a maintenance role over. We have sample code, examples that we use at conferences, for instance, and really everything in between. It's absolutely like a hot mess. It's even more a hot mess because we're an open source first company, so we'll put everything on GitHub, right? Our sort of mantra is that whenever something is broken, we should fix it upstream, which is a good thing to have. And we have a whole open source program office, which is full of people that just work on these open source upstream projects. And normally the development would happen on those projects and not on our forks, except of course when there is an exception. And unfortunately, there's always exceptions. For instance, one example of that is Kafka tiered storage. So normally we would only contribute to github.com/Apache/Kafka, but in this case we worked on Apache or github.com/Ivan/Kafka to add Kafka tiered storage. So Kafka tiered storage was a proprietary feature for a long time, and then Ivan decided to, together with the Kafka open source community, to open source the feature and make it available for the community. And all of that development happened on our fork initially. So we should do everything upstream, but that sometimes, things happen and that goes astray. So that just adds to the mess that we already had sort of on our GitHub organization. In this modern world, we rely on a lot of open source technology. I'm sure all of you know, but I also wanted to give you one statistic that I think is sort of like really illustrates the point, really drives it home, is that 97% of 2,400 commercial code bases contain open source software. And this is a number from the 2022 Open Source Security and Risk Report that is produced by Synopsys. That's a lot of open source we have in our code bases, right? In some cases, it's even like to 100%. So that's a massive number, and it's even more important to think that we have so much open source in our companies when you think about some of the issues that are plaguing open source. So one of them is license dependencies. What if some of the libraries that are core to your business decide that actually they want to change how open their code is and how freely available it is for you to use if they change their license? I think we've seen some of that recently with HashiCorp changing the license for Terraform. Another issue that is plaguing open source is maintainer burnout, and even more so in recent years. So I don't know how many people know this XKCD comic, but I think it illustrates the point really, really well, is that a lot of the tech that we rely on that is absolutely crucial to our infrastructure relies on a really small number of people. And that small number of people might get other priorities in life, right? Like they might want to decide they want to do something else than read through pull requests where people are very, very rude about the things that they want to have into the projects. So we're seeing maintainer burnout, and generally that also means that projects are more prone to supply chain attacks, and we've seen a lot of those in recent years as well. And then in open source, there is a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that has implications for how accessible projects are, but also for the longevity of some of those projects, like who will maintain these projects in the future. So open source, first is messy, open source is messy. I have a little audience participation bit because I want to know from you as well. And I wonder, can you raise your hand when you work for a company that open sources part of their work? I see a few hands. So maybe there's a library, right? Like you build it and you thought maybe other people will find it useful and you open source it. Okay, that was a good number of hands. Now I would like to know, do you get time to contribute to open source in your work time? Those are fewer hands. Okay, okay. What about if you okay? The question is, do you work on open source projects in work time because you rely on that project for your work? What I take from this, because there were more hands raised that you could work on open source in your work time than there were what if you rely on that project. So I guess that's a good trend, that you get to work on open source even if you don't necessarily rely on that technology. That's good to see. How do you manage your dependency on OSS? Now that was a trick question because you can't raise your hand for that because it's an open-ended question. It is something that I would love to talk to you about during these next 2 days in the hallway track because I'm really curious how you all handle this. All right. So back to the hundreds of repositories that we had in the main organization on GitHub for Ivan. So while having everything centralized, right, well, having everything in one place can be a good thing because there's also only one place that you have to go look for stuff. We had a couple of issues with this sort of mono organization, as we started to call it, and some of those issues we were able to group in 3 buckets, and so I want to dive into these 3 buckets one by one with you. One of them is security versus developer experience. Then there is the issue of, does this thing even work? And lastly, we can't improve what we can't measure. So we had no visibility over these different repositories and in which state they were. Okay, for security versus developer experience, we wanted to allow for certain repositories to be open for external contributions, right? Like we were looking for external contributors to join these projects. But we didn't want that openness to interfere with the security of some of our absolute core code, right? We needed a much simpler governance of non-core code so that we could quickly upload examples before we go to a customer or quickly make some changes to our demo before we have a conference presentation. And in the current mono organization, that was not possible because we had the same policies for every single repository, and they were kind of stringent, right? Like because we have some core code in there that we want to protect, but then that interferes with the ability to quickly move as well. We also knew that demos would really benefit from internal review and from continued maintenance if they were in the main organization and not, as was the case in point during this time, it was on a lot of individuals' GitHub accounts. And so we had no visibility whatsoever over how those repositories performed, if they got any external contributions, and when someone would leave the company, they would take all of that work with them, and that was not great. Also, access to all of these repositories were access was per repository basis, and the number of teams that we added to GitHub, because Teams is a feature on GitHub, was way past the point of being out of control. Like there were so many teams, people were in very random teams, and all of this could only be arranged within GitHub, while we use Okta for all of our other access control inside the company. But those two were completely disconnected. And there were definitely people in those teams that had admin roles that have since left the company. So this was a security concern. Does this thing even work? So we wanted to be able to automatically archive repositories after a certain amount of time of non-activity to really manage expectations for these repositories. We wanted to signal if they were still actively developed or not. We didn't want to signal that a project would be production ready for anyone to take and work with, when really it was just an experiment that we did once and then never looked at it again, and we haven't updated the dependencies in months. But the way that GitHub works is that every repository looks the same, right? It's just one big list. And so when an experiment lives among very serious projects that are actively maintained, they all look the same to someone who is just coming to our organization. So we want to make sure that we could make that distinction and then maybe freeze some repositories that no longer would be worked on. We also needed to have visibility over the ramifications whenever someone would leave the company, and make sure that ownership of a repository would be transferred to someone else within the company. We didn't have that whatsoever. So when we embarked on the story that I will tell, or on the journey that I will tell that I will talk about later, we found out that a lot of people were still owners of repositories that haven't worked for Ivan in like 3 to 4 years. So. We also wanted to do some kind of monitoring for these repositories in terms of responsiveness. Do people respond to when externals would create issues or would send in pull requests? Do they get handled in like a timely fashion, or is that something that we need work on? Like, do we need to assign some headcount to making sure that these external contributions get recognized? Also, kind of selfishly, being in the community team, like if issues don't get handled and pull requests don't get handled and we go to events, people will talk to us about it because they're not satisfied, right? So we wanted to make sure that we have at least visibility over responsiveness and being able to do something about that internally. But we only wanted to do that for select repositories, right? Like for some of the work that we do in open source, stuff that we have open sourced ourselves or have a maintainer role over. We didn't want to do that for instance, the Kafka repository, like the mirror of Kafka, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense. So actually we found out that for instance, the mirror of Kafka, we should add an issue template that whenever someone tried to add an issue to the mirror or add a pull request to the mirror, that they get sent to the upstream repository instead. And so we would say something like, thank you so much, but please consider contributing this upstream because we're not taking a pull request for this mirror. Okay, so we have all of these repositories. We have no visibility whatsoever, right? Like, it's just one big mess. And so we need to solve this. And we're a technology company, so what do we decide? We throw more technology at the problem. That's the only way to do it. So we did do that, though, but it worked out. So we spun up 2 more GitHub organizations. So now we have 3 GitHub organizations, right? And we set up some rules. So which ones would stay in the main organization? So Ivan, some projects that were open sourced or maintained by the open source program office would go in Ivan Open, and then all of the experiments, the sample code, the demos, they would move into Ivan Labs, which would be the most permissive organization just for like quick turnover. Involved in this project were people from the InfoSec team, from the community team, that's me, then the open source program office, and also brand. And why that is important, I will come back to in a little bit. Our internal customers are plenty, right? So we have the open source program office again as one of our customers, engineering, product support, solution architects, sales, DevRel. Really, actually, the whole company is our customer. And those are only the internal customers, because then for our open source projects, of course, we also have external customers as well that we need to take into account. So we created this, I love this slide. We created a spreadsheet because most of the problems you can actually solve with the spreadsheet. Did you know? We don't need really expensive tooling. We created a spreadsheet with all of the repositories and their desired homes, and then figured out who owned all of these repositories and started a migration program for all of these to the appropriate organizations. And then for some of the projects that didn't have an owner or an owner wouldn't be active with Ivan anymore, we found new maintainers as well. And some of those, actually, we couldn't find new owners, and that's also totally fine. And so we made sure that those were archives and that it was very, very visible that these wouldn't have active development anymore. This also, having InfoSec involved in the project also meant that they could finally start automating some of the controls over the different repositories, and so create some integration with Okta that I can talk about a little bit later. We also needed to do an inventory of all of the places that we referenced all of the repositories in our organization. So, for instance, in our docs or in our developer center or on the blog, we would reference some repositories, and we needed to have a list of those in order to update those. Now, in all honesty, that work is ongoing because first of all, it's a lot, but also it is not as critical as some of the other stuff, just because GitHub is really great with redirects. So when you move a repository, it doesn't care so much, it will just redirect. It might be a nice, spring cleaning project. Oh, yeah, right. So we had some added benefits from the move. For instance, that we could make sure that we use the same default branch for all of the repositories, because we definitely had a little mix of main and master and default and all that kind of stuff to make sure that there is just one term that we use for that, and also make sure that we update all of our community docs. So like make sure that the readmes are up to date, make sure the code of conduct is up to date with up-to-date contact information. So this was really an opportunity for us to also clean house. All right, so I already said we have 3 different organizations on GitHub now today, and I'm just introducing them to you so that you can see the differences. We have the OG, right, the original gangster Ivan. This is owned by product and engineering. It's all of the core and sort of production-ready repositories there, and all of the operators that we use and actively work on. So it's all of the mirrors for Kafka, Cassandra, ClickHouse, all of those. It's some proprietary stuff, of course, like what makes our platform. It's the developer center, it's the blog, it's the docs, because that's all internal stuff. Then we have Ivan Open, which is owned by the Open Source Program Office and by product for some specific projects. This is all of our open source work. This is definitely geared towards external contributors. So, for instance, there's one project, the specific Carapace that you see as one of the examples that is co-owned by the product team. I want to highlight 2 projects that are in here, or were in here, and why that transition has taken place. So the metadata parser was a very elaborate demo by one of the people in the DevRel team, showing how all of your data tools sort of like talk to each other, and made a beautiful dependency graph that you could sort of like drag and drop with. And so it started as a demo for a conference, but then it saw a lot of interest from the community and a lot of external contributions. So we actually moved that from the organization that we had for examples and samples and demos, and we moved this to Ivan Open to be more, have a more appropriate place for it to get further development. And then another one that I want to highlight is Pecco. I don't know if you know the Akka library, but Akka changed their license, I think last year, November-ish. And so we made a fork of the Akka project and named it Pecco. And it got started in the Ivan Open organization, but then once it saw more development and it got adopted by the Apache Software Foundation in their incubator program, it moved to the Apache Software Foundation organization on GitHub. So Pecco is no longer in there anymore, but just to show you sort of like the transition and the relationship between some of the different organizations that we have. So the last one I already talked about it, but it's Ivan Labs, and that's owned by developer relations, by marketing, by solution architects, and by support. These are all of our experimental repositories. It's demos, it's assets that we have maybe for slides, for presentations. The developer relations team also uses this to create some abstracts for a call for papers so that they can get reviews from others inside the company on their abstracts. And then we have an archivization strategy for these. So after 6 months of non-human activity, so that's not the Dependabot updates that we will get, but if there's no updates by humans, they get archived after 6 months. Again, to signal that these are not in active development, they're not production ready. Please don't use them in your systems ever, really. Okay, so for all these three organizations, we also thought about what integrations make sense for these, because not all integrations make sense for all the projects that we have. So for instance, we enable code spaces for Ivan Open. That makes sense, right? If people want to contribute to their projects, they should be, it should be simple to do so, that it shouldn't have to clone and like copy the whole repository to their personal systems and then make sure that their development environment actually works with the project. So that's something that is a no-brainer to enable for Ivan Open. And Gitpod is actually something that we enabled for Ivan Labs last week when we were rehearsing a workshop that we're doing in a week from now. And we figured out that Gitpod actually needs a couple of things from your organization in order for it to really connect to the organization. But because it is in Ivan Labs, and that's where all of our experimental stuff lives, that's the most permissive organization. It was really easy to get this through compliance. So in 1 hour, we had it. We were able to take it through compliance and use Gitpod for our workshops. So this switch to making sure that not everything has to live by the same rules also allows us to move really quickly whenever we need to. Okay, so that is all technology stuff. So that's really that's the easy part, right? The hard part is to make sure that people actually create the stuff in the right place in the first place, and that's a lot harder. Telling developers that they need to do something a different way than they are used to turns out to be really hard. Who knew? So we also figured that sort of personal pleas of why it is important that we're making this change still doesn't really help people a lot in understanding why they need to change the way that they work. So we figured that we needed a lot of things to be able to change their minds and change their hearts to this new way of working. One thing that is very important is documentation, and we needed the documentation really quickly, because when I initially scoped the project in December 2022, we had I think 217-ish repositories in the main organization, and then when I looked at it 2 weeks later, it was 236. So that's a lot of new repositories that were just created and added, and we wanted to make sure that people knew what to create in what place from the get-go. Also, as an example, right now in the main organization there's 241. So even though we removed a lot of repositories from the main organization, people still start creating new projects all the time. So we need a lot of documentation. And we wrote the descriptions that you saw on the slides before, but then with more words. We showed them that if they don't immediately know where a new project should live, we pointed them to 2 different Slack channels where they could reach out to either the open source program office or to community so that we could help them figure it out. We went on 2 different town halls, which are company-wide all-hands meetings that basically every individual in the company, if they are in the right time zone, will watch. But also the slides and the recordings are made publicly available after. So we did that twice to reiterate the story of why we're doing this change and how people should figure out where to put what. we added a lot of automation so that people would be added to the right organization for their sort of role in the company automatically, and they didn't have to think about it all that much. So sort of creating that golden path. So it's really hard actually to do the wrong thing. Make it easy to do the right thing. Also because now we had that Okta integration, people could go to the organizations that they're a part of through their Okta dashboard, which they use to have access to all of the other tools that they need on a daily basis. So we really integrated it in their normal daily business. Actually, on that role-based access control case in point, I can't actually see all of the repositories that we have in the Ivan main organizations because I don't have the appropriate level of access, right? And I think that's a good thing, first of all. But also, it doesn't really matter because all of the repositories that I don't have access to that are in the main organization are probably not projects that we want to move into more permissive organizations anyway. So that's all good. Now we can actually do some monitoring of the new repositories that are created. You see a little screenshot of a tool that one of our security people built to notify us which new projects are being added to which organization. They're actually looking to open source this bit, so that would go in the Ivan Open organization as a new project as well. That's been super helpful, so we can reach out to people when we think that they created the project in the wrong organization. I mentioned that this was a collaboration also with the brand team, and that means that we made sure that the different organizations, I guess you can't see it as well on the slides, but we made sure that the different organizations are also identifiable as 3 different organizations. So I did a little research before starting this project. There are more companies that have multiple organizations on GitHub, but mostly they use the same logo everywhere, so they're not visually distinct enough to really differentiate between the different organizations. So we made sure that they're visually different, and we also made use of a couple of features that GitHub gives you, because usually like everything on GitHub looks the same, right? But there's a couple of things that you can do to really show what something is about. And so one of the things that we used that is a GitHub functionality is to create a README for the organization. So not a README for a repository, but you can create a README for the organization. And we used the functionality to pin repositories to also highlight what repositories we thought are most reflective of that organization, and so people could jump right into. So in case that's something that you would want to do as well, creating the README of your organizations, think is a good thing anyway, whether you have 3 or 5 organizations or just the one, just to guide people on what to do when they land there. You go to your organization and you create a new repository, and that repository is .github. And then in that repository, you create a new folder that's called profile. And then in the profile, you create a README, and then success, profit. No, but it's a good way to guide people to see what they can do on your organization. All right, so this is not something you do from the get-go, right? Like you don't start a company and then you think about, oh, I probably need like 3 organizations on GitHub because there's all of this work that I want to do, and it's, like there's all these different projects and they need different homes and stuff. It's not something you do when you start. It's not something you can optimize for early on in your open source journey. You likely think that you're never going to need this, but you can anticipate a couple of these things a little bit better than maybe we did. You can create a good README, and you can create a good contributing file for all of your different repositories. You can do a regular sort of like state of my repositories type of action, where you look at which ones are still actively developed and which aren't, and maybe archive those to make sure that people don't go to these repositories and think that they're in active development. But definitely something that you can do early on is look at the ownership for different projects and think about how you want to do access control for all of these projects as well. So you can definitely have a look at centralizing some of that automation for the different teams and their access levels for all of your repositories. So to keep an eye on whenever someone leaves your company or joins your company, that they have a much easier time of finding the repositories that they're responsible for, and also to create succession plans for whenever you want to transfer ownership over these different repositories and projects. And then I hope that you don't end up in the same sort of hot mess that we got ourselves into. I think that's it. This is the core team that worked on this project. Good thing they don't take themselves too seriously. One of them identifies as a strawberry, so it was really fun. This was a really fun, despite what you think, it was a really fun project to work on with the security team. I want to leave you with two small things, although I don't know if this one needs any more promotion than it already did. We're running a meetup on Sunday at the CRED offices, but I think the waiting list is already quite ridiculously full. But if people are so nice and they update their RSVP, maybe you can still join us, and I think otherwise we'll do a recording or a live stream. I'm just checking with the other organizers of this meetup. It's the first open source data infrastructure in India, and we'll have fantastic talks about data tools. So if that's something you're interested in, keep an eye on that page, and then hopefully we'll release some recording of that soon. And then also one more thing, it's Hacktoberfest. Who's participating in Hacktoberfest? So many hands. Who knows? Who knows about Hacktoberfest? That it's a thing. There's more hands. Okay, cool. So it's October. It's Hacktoberfest. It's an annual celebration of open source software and making contributions to open source software. And it's mostly led by DigitalOcean. And this year, the Claw team is, Claw is a project at Ivan in the Kafka space. We're participating in Hacktoberfest, and we created a little live stream around us participating in Hacktoberfest and all of the issues that we triaged specifically for Hacktoberfest. So this is a fun live stream to check out. We talked to Tim from DigitalOcean, who talks about Hacktoberfest, and some of the members of the Claw team telling you what kind of contributions you can make. Anyway, check it out. Can't wait what the rest of this day brings, and I am looking forward to learn from all of you, especially on how you manage your open source projects, and let's chat. Thank you so much.
You described your problem of sharing your code, or basically access of your repositories, or what is your repository doing? How did you resolve it?
Oh, so yeah, so for different repositories, we figured that some of them shouldn't be as open as we maybe have them, and others they were too closed off, and so it depends really per repository how we handled it. We just turned out we just needed to have a really good look of all of the projects that we have in flight and figure out, how we should actually architect them so that other people could potentially contribute to them, or make sure that they're not ready for contributions, and nor will they ever be, and close them off a little bit more. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, yes.
My question is around GitHub pipelines. If you have used GitHub runners anywhere, what is the general practice of having the pipeline? Is it part of the main repository itself, or is it a separate repo? How do you move to production? Do you have something part of the repo itself, and you have a production pipeline separately? What are the general practices around GitHub pipelines?
We can talk about that in the break, but the short answer is it depends, because most of these repositories and projects they have different owners, and different owners have different are like autonomous teams, right? And so they have different practices that they will follow to release a project. So it's really on a per repository basis, and so there's no default necessarily that we use or enforce our teams to use. Right? Thanks again.